Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this conversation around domestic violence. I'm Councilwoman Krystal Oriadha, representing District 7 here in Prince George's County. Before we get started, I always like to give people another minute or two to join our live stream and our team a moment to share it out. So if you just give us maybe another minute, we'll go ahead and get the conversation started soon. All right. I want to be mindful of everyone's time. And again, if you know someone that will benefit from this conversation, please tag them in the chat and feel free to share this to different groups that you're a member in. Good evening again. And thank you for joining this domestic violence webinar. I am Councilwoman Krystal Oriadha, representing District 7 here in Prince George's County, and I will be your host today. And I'm really excited to have the platform and opportunity to have this conversation, but saddened that we still have to have this conversation, that this is an issue that's so prevalent in our community. But it's important that everyone knows about the resources that are available to them and that we have an open dialogue so that people can understand they're not alone and that there's so many people that are experiencing the same thing and that there's support and avenues out there for you. I also know that this conversation can be one that can be difficult and triggering for people, and that's not our intention. Our intention is to make sure that people have resources. So we'll be sharing resources here in the chat with you on how to get help. And then also, if you might have a loved one that is dealing with this and you've seen the signs, but you're not sure what to do, we'll also be having a conversation about that as well. I'm excited to be joined by a panel that touches the domestic violence conversation in so many different ways. So I will allow them each to introduce themselves, say a little bit about their profession, and then what they hope to contribute to the conversation this evening around domestic violence. And I'll start with you, Erica.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much, Councilwoman, for having me here today. Hello, I am Erica Turner. I am Chief Clinical Officer at Community Crisis Services Incorporated. We're the largest crisis services agency in Prince George's County. And I am a clinician, a mental health clinician by training, but I have the wonderful opportunity to serve on the executive team at CCSI. We have 3 large umbrellas of services, one to include domestic violence, homelessness, and behavioral health services. So as we continue the conversation, we'll be able to share a little bit more about the domestic violence services and resources that we have.
Thank you. Sheriff?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Assistant Sheriff Stephen Upathamkhabul here on behalf of Sheriff John Carr. I work and oversee the Bureau of Field Operations. What that encompasses is our warrant division, our civil division, behavioral health, child support, and our domestic violence intervention unit. So we respond to 911 calls for emergency. We serve peace and protective orders. We also do domestic standbys where we allow people to get items out of their home. And what I hope to give and provide for this is just resources and a little education about the sheriff's office and how we can help fight and combat domestic violence.
Thank you. And Dr. McCain?
Yes, good evening, everyone. Denise McCain. I am the director of the Prince George's County Family Justice Center, which is an initiative of the Circuit Court. For those that don't know, the Family Justice Center is a one-stop shop resource that provides an array of comprehensive services for survivors of not just domestic violence, but also sexual assault, human trafficking, and elder abuse. We do this with the support of 21 on-site partners, both local government as well as community-based nonprofits. And really our goal is to make the process more efficient, more holistic, and more client-centered by eliminating the need for a survivor to go to multiple locations to get the support and services that they need. I have been in this field now for over 25 years. It seems like a long time, but probably even longer. And I come with a very extensive background from working in varying fields, including grassroots advocacy, a former program administrator, as well as a grant funder, and even lived experiences as a child of a victim of abuse. I hope that this session will really highlight, well, I shouldn't use the word highlight, but illuminate what domestic violence is, with the understanding that it doesn't always manifest itself in the form of physical abuse, which is what I think people generally associate with domestic violence, that there are many other ways in which victims are being abused, and the fact that it's not always easy to come out and get help. So hopefully this session will allow people to feel more comfortable to reduce some of the stigmas associated with seeking help behaviors, and help and provide the resources and help.
Thank you. And I think it's really important, for me, within, I think, the last probably year or so, I've been more transparent and open with my history as a survivor of domestic violence. And I said that because the point that was made already by some of our panelists, that it's a hard conversation to have. Some people aren't comfortable sharing that, and they don't have to share their lived experience. And the idea of what I always say a so-called victim looks like. And so a lot of times people have this conversation with not understanding how, right? How could that happen? And a lot of times the individual thinks to themselves, how could I allow this to happen to myself? And so for me, this is an issue that's really important for my lived experience. Also, I've worked with HHS, working on the national level around domestic violence, and specifically youth domestic violence. And I think that it's really important that we take down the stigma around domestic violence and the idea and the stereotypes of what it looks like, what a so-called, I hate to use the word victim, but what a victim's supposed to look like and what an abuser is supposed to look like. And just understand these are all just humans that are being impacted and affected by this traumatic event. And it can manifest itself in so many different ways, shapes, and look totally different. So I wanted to create a space for each of the panelists just to share, because I think we all have a lens or an experience that brings us to the table. It could be personal or something that we've witnessed in the profession, just to humanize all of our lived experiences in this moment. So I will go ahead and start with you, Sheriff Steve, of any experience that you want to like kind of anchor us in from your lived experience.
Well, like you said, I've been a deputy sheriff for over 20 years, and I worked domestic violence, I ran calls, I served protective orders, I've done standbys, I've kind of seen it all. I haven't personally been involved in domestic violence, but my aunt actually was killed in a domestic violence situation, so it kind of hits real close to home. But it's you know, like Denise said, it's something that needs to be really illuminated, because we're seeing it trend upward, and that's not what we want to see happen.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Denise?
You know, just as, you know, I started out saying that this is obviously a very serious issue, and I applaud you and thank you for the platform and opportunity to discuss this. You know, we've moved beyond October, but, you know, of course, this is not a 30-day issue. It's, you know, 24/7, 365 days a year. So we should talk about it more frequently. But again, I think the real takeaways, or something that I think for me is the fact that we work in this field and, we see the incidences happen. And unfortunately, many of the people that we serve are repeats. They come back. It is a vicious cycle. And, there's a need for education, for understanding of it. But at the same token, I think sensitivity for persons who've not been involved or who don't have a direct experience to not be judgmental, but understand the dynamics of abuse and that it's not as easy for a person to leave an abusive situation. People oftentimes say, well, why don't you just walk away? Why don't you leave? Which is, by the way, the worst thing you could say to a victim, because you're placing the blame back on that person. But there's so many factors that contribute to an individual's inability to walk away from that situation. As I stated, I'm the child of a victim, and my mother didn't have an education. She didn't work. She was totally dependent on my father financially. She wanted me to have a better life. And I clearly remember her saying to me over and over again, get your education, get a good job so that if you ever find yourself in a situation like this, you'll be able to leave. And so for her, education, upward mobility was her goal for me, to ensure that I did not repeat that pattern, because it is also learned behavior. So all in all, I understand it. And I think that's one of the things I'm most grateful for in doing this work. The ability to take my lived experience when women and men come to the Family Justice Center for help. I'm not just there as a program director. I'm there as a human, someone who knows how difficult it was for that person to walk in the door, some of the things that they're going through and experiencing at home, and just the fact that they're out now publicly sharing those very intimate personal details about something that no one would ever expect to have to discuss with strangers. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge, but the work is there and the need is there. Sadly, the need is there.
Well, thank you both for sharing your experiences and things that you bring with you to this work. That's so important. We lost Erica, so I'm not skipping over, but when she joins back, we'll get her back into the conversation. I wanted to share a couple of stats before we dive into the Q&A section that I think is really important just here in the state of Maryland. In 2021, there were over 58,000 domestic violence incidents that's just reported to law enforcement agencies in the state. And that's important to say that were reported because we know so much in this work that there's so many incidences that happen that are never going to be reported. People think, one, no one's going to believe me, or they think that there's shame. And they're embarrassed by coming forward, and fear, and so many other reasons why they're not going to report the incident. We also know that there's a lot of costs associated with domestic violence. I always talk from a policy perspective. When we talk about not addressing fundamental issues in our community, there's these indirect costs associated with domestic violence, including medical expenses, loss of productivity, increase in criminal justice system costs, and we're talking about millions of dollars each year in the state of Maryland. So that's when some people want to look at the numbers and the data behind it, it's also important that we address this issue because there's also huge economic impact on the system when we don't address domestic violence. Also, when we talk about just the state of Maryland, 1 in 4 women will experience domestic violence in their lifetime. And that's just a stat for here in Maryland. And that's staggering data, right? When we think about how close it can touch an individual. And just on this call, right, just right here on this panel, each of us have an experience of either a loved one experiencing it or experiencing it ourselves. And so people don't realize how close it can be to you. So now I want to go ahead and start with some questions. First, we really want to look at the frequently asked questions that we sometimes see from domestic violence survivors. And one of those things are, what are the warning signs of domestic violence? And Erica, I'll start with you.
Yes. So the warning signs, Domestic violence is really about power and control. So one of the things that we always talk about is the power and control wheel. And there are several different aspects on that wheel that are sort of spelled out as warning signs. They include things like making threats, uh, intimidation, minimizing, blaming, all of those things, emotional abuse, financial control, isolation, all of those things are clear signs of domestic violence. And I like what you said earlier, Councilwoman, about domestic violence impacting everyone, and it impacting people in a way that they don't even realize that they're being impacted or abused or intimidated, because domestic violence does affect everybody, no matter who you are, what you look like. All of those things really don't sort of tie into being a survivor of domestic violence, but those are just some of the signs.
No, thank you. Anyone else want to add anything to warning signs for domestic violence? Okay. What are some of the causes of domestic violence? I hear that a lot as well. When people think, well, how do we get here? Why? And so I will start with Denise.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're
Challenge. Good. So, again, there are many causes or reasons why. Oftentimes, as I said earlier, in one sense, it's learned behavior. Children who live in homes where they're exposed to violence or abuse in the home, there's a greater probability that they will either become victims and or perpetrators themselves, because it's a natural thing. That's how they learn to resolve conflict. As was stated, it is about power and control. So it's a very unhealthy way of dealing with relationships. So that's one of the reasons, or causes, I should say. Quite surprisingly, there's also this element of low self-esteem. People also who are both victims and perpetrators tend to have very low self-esteem. And because of the power and control, they use their victim or the abuser, or the victim feels a sense and need to be with someone because of their self-esteem or lack of confidence. They have bought into what an abuser will tell them to make them feel less than, or that they're not capable of, or that no one else would want them. Those are some of the factors that lead to that. A very big misnomer, people have oftentimes associated alcohol and drugs with abuse, but that is not a causal factor. People that drink or take drugs are not just automatically disposed to becoming violent. It's a contributing factor that may increase or escalate incidents for someone who would already be there. But, it really depends on the person. But I would say for the most part, just exposure, whether it be in the home, in the community, learned behavior. We see it a lot with children, with youth, music, videos, television, games. All of those things are elements that do lead a person to identify with being violent, and even in their relationships.
Well, that's such a good point, especially I think that learned behavior. That was similar in my case, where my partner had come from abusive household. And it was so interesting because when we met, I was aware of that, and they had articulated how much that upset them and how much they wouldn't want to repeat that. But then it ended up being a pattern that they repeated. So it can even sometimes happen, maybe not with the intention, but I think to your point about this is how you've learned how to respond to certain situations without that needed therapy or conversation or access to resources early to learn other ways to address issues. So just thank you for articulating that point.
I would just add to that, which goes to your point, which I think is so interesting, is that it's not even an intentional process. Even as you pointed out that, in your situation, your abuser knew what it looked like and made a statement that they did not want to do that, but it's a passive learning process. How many times do you see children, or even we ourselves, have you not heard yourself say or do something that your parent did, unknowingly? It's just something that was there. So you just automatically take on that behavior or say those same things or do things the way your parents did because you were in that environment. So I just want to point out to your point that it wasn't even intentional. They don't think that this is what I'm going to do. It's just what you know. So it's a passive learning process.
Exactly. Did anyone else want to add anything around the causes of domestic violence before we moved on?
Yes, I would like to just add, just sort of making it sort of clear that there is nothing that one person can do to cause someone else to be abusive to them. When we talk about the causes, that really is on the person who is the abuser. So I just want to be able to clarify that for anyone who might be, experiencing domestic violence. There's nothing that you can do for somebody to cause you to be abused. And sometimes we hear that, abusers will say things like, well, if you were to do X different, then I wouldn't have to do this. And they will put that blame on you. But we just want to be able to clarify, while there are causes for domestic violence, there's nothing that what a person can do to cause them to be abused.
Thank you so much for articulating that, because that's so true, that these causes are internal to the person or external to their environment and things that they've experienced, but in no way, shape, or form attached to the individual that they're abusing.
Absolutely.
And that's so important to know for anyone that is dealing with that currently. Next, we want to talk a little bit about this question: how does someone know if they're being abused? Because this comes up a lot in those conversations where you can visually see something, like some of the advocacy work I've done around abuse, and try to tell someone that, and they're adamant that they're not in an abusive relationship, that is not what they're experiencing. So kind of, I think it's a two-part kind of question about how and what someone should think, what should they ask themselves, and then how do you have that conversation with someone that can believe that they're not in an abusive relationship. And we'll start with you, Assistant Sheriff.
Well, your question was, how does someone know if they're being abused? And I think Erica and Denise touched on some of this and some of the things they said. But like you said, there are signs that they're being abused that they might not recognize themselves, being isolated from their normal group of friends, having their phone taken and their social media stuff looked at and access to their emails and, being controlled and stuff like that. The abuse can be psychological, it can be physical, it can be financial, taking someone's money or access to their ATM card. There's a lot of things that I think people don't realize that is abuse that unfortunately is abuse. And that's why a forum like this is so great to show people those different things.
No, I think that's such a good point. And it's not always this way, but I always think of sometimes, at least from what I experienced, the abuse is always escalating. And so it's a lot of the things that you mentioned, which are the first signs. And that I think about even for myself, like if I had seen it earlier, before it had progressed to the level of like isolation and physical abuse, if I'm being, honest, and I started to self-reflect, I'd saw signs of it early on, but it had escalated over time. And so I think that's what's so important about understanding what abuse looks like and the levels and then when I say levels, because all abuse is equal to me, but I kind of look at it as the stages of abuse that some people go through, where it starts and it grows and it escalates and becomes something else. And then that question about the different types of abuse. So we hear people say, there's domestic abuse and domestic violence and then intimate partner violence, and there's these terms, and people aren't necessarily familiar with what the difference is between those. So I'll leave this open to anyone that wants to answer, like the fundamental difference between those, the terminology when people are talking about those different types of abuse.
So, I legally, law-wise, I'll break it down. Domestic abuse could be one or more of the abusive acts, like I mentioned, either physical, psychological, financial, between a family and household member, and it can include children and vulnerable adults. Domestic violence, same thing, one or more abusive acts between family, household members. It could even be sexual assault. And then intimate partner violence is physical, sexual, psychological abuse of a person that they're partnered with or their spouse. And that's kind of like the legal, breakdown of it.
Anyone else want to add anything to that?
I think Assistant Sheriff pretty much covered it. I would just clarify or highlight the fact that, you have to be, for the intimate partner abuse, what would constitute one's ability to get protections under the law, such as a protective order. They would have to be in an intimate relationship with that individual within a year's time period, and or have a child in common with that person, or was recently involved with them, again, within the last 12 months. Those are some of the elements I think that make it confusing for people to know whether or not they qualify for a protective order in an intimate partner situation, or maybe it's a peace order if they don't meet that criteria. So those are some of the things that I think get a little sticky and can be challenging for people that don't really know. And it's unfortunate. I had a phone call today with someone who was very frustrated getting the runaround. And, she said, quite frankly, I've never had to deal with this before, so I don't understand it. I don't know. And people keep telling me different things. And it is true. This is one of those topics and areas that you don't know until you're there, and you need to know about it. So it can be very confusing.
Exactly. Like you said, because you hear people say, well, just go get this. This is what you need to get. But then when you sit down and you go, they say, oh, well, you're not eligible for this. Actually, you need to apply for something different. Because I'll remember my sister also experienced domestic violence, and there was incidents when I was in high school, and it was the moment I realized that she was in a violent relationship. We were out together, and he, attacked her, and I stepped in between the two of them, and he ended up attacking me. I had to have my mouth wired shut. And I remember going to the court, and this was in Texas, and they said I couldn't do anything, that my sister had to do it because they were in a relationship, and I wasn't. So I didn't qualify for a protective order, a peace order, or anything. And in that circumstance, she ended up not going through with it because, with a lot of abuse, you go back and forth, and it takes a long time for you to get to a place where you can actually leave. But that was the first time I realized what you just said about what you're eligible for, what you're not eligible for, what they consider for you to be able to have protection. And so it can be jarring to someone that is trying to enter the system to get help, to realize that maybe they're not going to be able to get the help that they thought they could. And so that leads to the next set of questions that really want us to focus on when people are ready to leave and escape the situation and get help. What does that look like? So first I want to start with where could people find access to shelter? I think that sometimes is the number one thing when they're trying to leave an abusive relationship. And I'll start with you, Erica.
Yes. So one of the things that we do here at Community Crisis Services is we operate the Prince George's County Domestic Violence Hotline. It is a 24/7 hotline where people can call, obviously 24/7, to be able to get safe shelter, along with a lot of other resources. And that phone number is 301-731-1203. And again, you can call that phone number and request shelter placement if that is something that is needed. And if it's not something that's needed, we can also, to sort of help you to navigate through the system, like the both of you just shared, it is kind of confusing. There are a lot of different nuances and aspects to seeking help and what people qualify for. And so it is important to be able to know that that's a resource that you can get just by dialing that 10-digit phone number 24/7. There's also a domestic violence chat. We recognize that there's a safety issue with seeking shelter and seeking supports and fleeing a domestic violence situation. So we know that there is, we provided a domestic violence chat on our website where you can, again, 24/7 be able to reach out to be able to get supports via the chat as well.
And then also, oh, no, go ahead, Denise.
No, and I was just going to say, obviously, shelter is, a great resource for someone, particularly who's in a very serious and dangerous situation. But again, it's important to recognize that everyone is not necessarily ready to leave and or go into shelter, particularly, even if it's the best thing you think they should do. For many reasons, they're not ready to go into a shelter. So one of the things that we also do is to give individuals, victims, a safety plan. Whenever someone is attempting or thinking about leaving an abusive situation, that's a time when they're in the greatest degree of danger. So, we want people to be prepared to protect themselves because, again, they're already in an abusive relationship. And now that I'm thinking about leaving, you certainly don't want to let an abuser know that that's the plan. So we work with our survivors, giving them individualized safety plans based on their unique set of circumstances to help them remain safe, even if they're leaving or not. But a safety plan is critical to any situation when a person is attempting to leave.
Absolutely. No, that's so true, because there's things that you cannot think about that can skip your mind, but that could be the difference between life and death for an individual. And so I think it's so important that you articulate that planning part and having someone that can help you think through the things that you need to do so that you can be in the safest position possible. Because just from my lived experience, I didn't think of something so small of changing the locks on my home. But luckily I was having a conversation with one of my best friends and she said, you need to change your locks today, like today. And kid you not, that night is when the person tried to come into the home around 11 p.m. that night, enraged. But if I hadn't even thought about changing the locks. So I just think it's so crucial what you said, having those people that can help you think through the things that you need to do, the things that you need to address to make sure that you're in the safest position possible. And we talked about it a little bit, just the process if someone wanted to get a restraining order or to reach out to law enforcement and what that process would look like. Because some people leave and they just leave. And it doesn't have anything to do with law enforcement and getting a protective order or calling the police. And then some people, that's the route of protection. And so I'll yield to you, Sheriff.
Yeah, so how people can get a protective order, there's several different ways. One of the ways is at the courthouse, Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 4:30 in Upper Marlboro or Hyattsville. We have an emergency courtroom that sees and hears domestic violence survivors to seek out protective orders. After hours, when courts close, we have the commissioner's office in Hyattsville and Upper Marlboro. We also have special victim assistants here at the sheriff's office that can help walk someone through. And we're all partners on this fight. The FJC is a tremendous resource where they can go to as well to get guidance and CCSI to help them navigate the process, because they're already dealing with a traumatic situation, and to navigate the court system, if you've never dealt with it, can be frustrating, even on a good day. So having someone there to kind of walk you through that process and be that support system for you is huge to help you navigate that, especially when you're dealing with this. And then obviously, in an emergency, 911. In districts 3 and 8, the sheriff's office responds to the calls for service. But 911, if it's an emergency, you can call the police and we can get out there and give you a ride if need be to help facilitate that protective order. So to summarize it, the courthouse Monday through Friday during business hours, the commissioner's office after hours, an emergency 911, the Family Justice Center, CCSI, we're all here to help navigate and help that person.
Thank you. And that's just like, from my understanding, the starting point, then you'll get like a court date, or if you go down to the courthouse, does it happen in real time? So I know with the commissioner's office, then they'll get like a temporary, but I've never helped someone do it in real time without going to the commissioner. So I'm just curious if that happens faster than going in the evening.
Yeah. So what happens in the daytime when you go to court and you're heard by the judge, you'll get a temporary protective order, and that'll be good up until your final court or your final protective order hearing. When court's closed, you get what's called an interim from the commissioner, and that's good for 24 hours. And the deputies at the sheriff's office try to serve that immediately once those are issued within that 24-hour time period. But then you will have subsequent court following that. You'll have your, if it's an interim, you'll have a temporary protective court hearing. After your temporary protective court hearing, you'll have a final protective order. So if there are grounds to issue a final protective order, that'll be good for a year and can be extended up to 6 months after that year, that protection is good for.
And this is something I'm not familiar with. I've had this conversation, I'm not sure the process, where someone would have to give up their gun or firearm. Or is there anything when it comes to like protective orders, peace orders, where they would have to, or is that actually with like a conviction or something different that they have to actually give up their weapon?
No, that's great, Krystal, and I thank you for bringing that up. So there's also another one called an emergency risk protective order, where we're given the legal right to seize any firearms that someone might have. That's another one, but in a regular protective order, it also can state that they shall surrender their firearms to law enforcement. So it's case by case, but a regular protective order, if in there, we can take firearms for safekeeping. And then there's that other one, the emergency risk protective order, where we're supposed to seize their weapons. We give them an opportunity to turn them in. If they don't, we can apply for a search warrant and then go back and serve that search warrant and recover any firearms.
Well, that's good to know for people, like if you know that the person that you're dealing with has access to a gun, or to make sure that's noted and know the various ones, at least you could different types of protective orders that you could go for. And another thing that's come up recently is this conversation around custody and children, especially with abusive partners, and the question of, can the abuser fight for custody, or what does that look like? Like when you have a protective order, but you have not worked out custody agreements. So just anything around what the rights are, or any information about the processes of what that could look like. And I'll leave that open to anyone to answer.
Yeah, so what we see majority of the time when someone gets a protective order is they can petition the court to give them temporary custody of the children. So we see that a lot of times in a protective order, the person will have temporary custody until the court hearing, and then at that court hearing, then they can navigate what they're going to do as far as custody rights. But yes, an abuser has the right to fight for custody of their children, but it's going to be left up to the court when it gets into the court's hands as far as the temporary custody or pursuing child custody order.
Do anyone have anything to add? Yes.
Yeah, I would just add that they're just separate proceedings, that, you can ask for parental rights in a protective order, which again, I think it's important. Just the very same conversation I had today with the same survivor who's in a situation very similar with the child, with the abuser. But one thing to remember is that during that process for the final protective order hearing, it's important for the person, the petitioner, the survivor, to ask for what they want. because the judge is not there to give advice. In fact, the judge ethically can't give advice. So, you have to go to court prepared and know that if you want to have temporary custody of your child during that time period, you have to state that, you have to ask for it. If you want emergency assistance, financial assistance, you have to ask for it. If you want the abuser to go to abuser intervention counseling, you have to ask for it. The judge is not going to say, well, what would you like me to do? Or how can I make this better for you now? That's not their role. So it's important for a survivor to go to court and to be prepared. And then with the custody component, beyond that temporary time period that the survivor may have custody of the child, it would be important to then file another petition, a court order for custody, which is a completely different legal process and court proceedings. So you can get immediate temporary custody, but for full or permanent custody, that would be, or even joint custody, that would be a separate order and legal proceeding.
Thank you. And for our listeners that are not experiencing domestic violence themselves, but know someone that is experiencing domestic violence, some of times it's really hard for that individual to know how to help, what to do. And then sometimes the things not to do. Because I've experienced someone that told, there was a person I was working with that was experiencing domestic violence, and their loved one said to them that if you continue the relationship, then I'll no longer be, in your life. And I had to say I was like, that's the exact thing that the abuser's trying to put in their head, that no one else is going to be there for them but them. But the loved one was trying to do it as an ultimatum that they felt would put pressure and would have a positive impact. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the things that people can do, the things that people should try not to do when trying to help someone in a domestic violence situation. And Erica, do you want to start?
Yes. So I would say that there's three main things. The first one would be to listen. And we'll touch on this as we go along, but there is a behavioral health or mental health impact that someone experiences when they are a survivor of domestic violence. And so we know that having that non-judgmental listening ear is something that is very helpful to someone going through a domestic violence situation. So you want to listen. You also want to be patient and understand, like we mentioned before, that it takes time. It is not an immediate process. There are a lot of things associated with it. There's safety aspects, there's considerations, there's safety plan. A lot of things go into this. And so it is not immediate. And sometimes it takes the time. So you want to be patient and provide that, that non-judgmental listening ear. And then lastly, I would say we need to ask, how can I help? What can I do? A lot of times we sort of have it in our minds what people need to do, right? But we are not in that situation ourselves. So it's easy from the outside looking in and say, do this, and you need to do that, and blah, 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 right? And maybe those are some things that need to do, but maybe they're not ready. So again, asking how you can support and figuring out what that looks like, and just being able to be patient and support that person through their situation.
Thank you. Denise?
Yeah, to everything that Erica said, I would also add to educate yourself, to become familiar with resources, to be able to share that information with the family member or friend, whomever it is, and also to know what it looks like when you see it, because again, it's not always obvious. So to be aware of the signs, notice the differences, and be comfortable approaching the person, but in a way that's non-judgmental, that shows that you're really being caring. Hey, I noticed that you seem to be a little down, or something going on, or, it's hot outside. Why are you wearing all these long, heavy clothes? Is something happening here? But to do it in a way so that the person understands that you're really trying to help them, that you're there to be supportive. And to that point, I think because it's not a given that the person is going to immediately say, this is what's going on, I need help. it's hard to talk about it or even to admit that you're being victimized, is to be patient, but also to be there for the long haul, and to know that it may not be a overnight process where the person is ready to talk or leave or to get help or to even accept the support that you may be willing to offer them. Because again, it's just not a black and white scenario. All situations differ and everyone is different. I would add to not doing, something that I've learned is that you don't want to badmouth the abuser. It sounds kind of obvious, and you'd say, well, of course, he's a horrible person, and what I'm saying, everybody knows, but you don't do that, because basically what we're doing, or what you're doing when you do that, is that you're showing the victim that you don't care for this person, and or that if they go back, because more often than not they will, particularly early on, they're not going to come back to you again because they know what you think about that person. So to that point, you don't say, I told you so, or, this is why you shouldn't be with them. No matter what you think or feel, remember that it's not about you. It's about the survivor. It's about the victim, and your job. And as a friend or family member, the role is to be there, to listen, to be non-judgmental, to be supportive, to have information and resources that you can share, and to let the person know that you're there for them and that you will be there for them. And if they need to just call you.
No, that's such a good point that you bring up around not talking ill of them, of the person that they're dealing with, so that they know that they can always come back to you, and just being such a judgment-free zone. That's the recommendation I give to anyone dealing with any type of trauma, is just creating this space where it feels as if there's no judgment. You're just listening and doing your best to assist them. And I think a good point you also made is educating yourself, because there are a lot of minds you can step on, but you're not sure of them because you haven't kind of educated yourself on just these key information, or you might not have the resources when they're ready, so they can come to you and help, and then you don't know either where to send them. So that preparation is key. And last, I think that point of noticing the signs, because I can say for myself, I think the first time I ever was able to even broach the topic of abuse in our relationship was because someone pulled me aside and said they had noticed it, like they had seen it in the relationship. And I think before that moment, I was in that space of where if I could just be better, and if I could just not be so difficult, and if I could stop frustrating them, then they wouldn't do this, right? But it took someone else from the outside to come and just softly pull me aside and say, I've noticed and seen that this person is abusing you, and do you need help? And it was the first time I think I was able not to place the judgment on the responsibility on me. Because in that moment, like so many survivors of violence, we think it's our fault. And if we could just do better or change in some way, shape, or form, this will stop.
Right. So your abuser did his job, basically made you feel that it wasn't him. It was you. It was all your fault. You're the reason why I'm treating you this way, or this happened because of you. It's not about them. There's no accountability on their part. It's always blaming the victim. So yeah, they did their job. He did his job.
Exactly. And I think too, after someone has made the decision to leave and they've made that step of leaving, I think becomes probably one of the most crucial things is healing from that trauma, and putting yourself back together, to be honest, building back everything around your self-esteem that person broke, and figuring out how to not bring this into the next relationship if you want to have a healthy relationship after that. And so there's going to be a lot of work mentally that's going to happen. And so just some ideas of the resources and avenues for that, dealing with the trauma that someone might experience. And so I'll leave that open for anyone to start.
Well, I would like to share that what you just mentioned, Councilwoman, is very real. That there is a behavioral health impact, mental health impact to someone who is a survivor of domestic violence. There's associated guilt and shame and trauma and a lot of different things. And so we want to encourage people to that it's okay that that happened. We're sorry that happened, but there is help to be able to move forward. And so the main way to be able to address that is to be able to see a therapist. There's a lot of talk around mental health and how it impacts our entire communities. And so we want to encourage people, going to therapy is cool, working on yourself is cool. Those are things that we should be doing, is to work and to be better and to be able to come through a situation. And so 988 is a national suicide and crisis lifeline. But we at 988 have the resources to be able to connect people to therapists, to treatment providers. And we also can just listen at 988. If you need that sounding board, you might not be ready, or you might be ready. You don't have anybody to talk to, and you just need to talk and to, again, have that non-judgmental ear. You can call, text, or chat 988 and be able to connect to the resources, to a live crisis counselor, and to get connected to a therapist. So just want to encourage people, going to therapy is a good thing.
Definitely. Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead, Denise.
I would just concur and say absolutely that counseling therapy is critical. I think that if you understood how you got there, you wouldn't be there. And without addressing it, you're doomed to repeat those same behaviors, the same patterns. So, and it's not something that you can do by yourself. So I just think that therapy is critical for anyone who's in a situation, in an abusive relationship, or coming out of one, in order to fully heal and to recover and to understand what led you there and why you stayed there. And it's almost like a deprogramming, because as we talked about, abusers are very, very good at making the victim think that they're wrong and bad and everything that happened was their fault. So it really does take someone else to help you step out of that mindset and recognize that no matter what was going on, that behavior, you didn't deserve to be abused, and that it was abuse. It was abuse.
Right. I think that is just what you said right there, that it was abuse. And being able to say that to yourself, because so many times you'll want to, sometimes as the individual, soften it, that it wasn't, or other people will want to, depending upon if they couldn't visually see it, or if it was financial and psychological versus physical, like that they'll want to say, well, what is that really abuse? Or try to put a level to the abuse. Right. It wasn't as bad because it's not like they physically harmed you. And so I think that's really powerful, to have the ability to say and own that it was abuse. And no matter what, the abuser wants to say, or anyone else from the outside wants to say. And a part of that journey is, I think, that therapy and having those conversations, because a lot of that fear comes with, are people are going to believe me? And what I can say from my experience is that you have to let that go as part of your process, that it has nothing to do with if someone believes you or not, because they weren't there, they didn't experience it. You don't need them to validate your experiences at all. And so it was one of the things that I had to really grapple with, because I struggled with, if someone thought that, my abuser was very charming and very nice, and I just couldn't imagine it, that it brought me back to like, well, did I imagine it? Like, was it just not that real? Am I? Right. And I think that happens to a lot of people. So letting go what anyone else thinks is going to be a huge part of that healing process. And so, no, go ahead. Just want to have something to add. Okay. We did lose the sheriff, but hopefully he'll jump back on. But I wanted to go into the next part of our conversation, which is really important part probably one of the most important parts, making sure everyone leaves with a really good understanding of all the resources that are available, really in-depth knowledge about what the different organizations on the call do, and how they can be a service of to you or to your family, and how to get in contact with them. So we will start with you, Erica, to sharing a little bit more about the resources, how people can get in contact with you to get the help that they need.
Yes. So Community Crisis Services operates the domestic violence shelter in Prince George's County. And I shared the number earlier, but I'm going to say it again. It's 301-731-1203. And that number is operable 24/7. And you can call it at any time. There's also a domestic violence chat on our website, ccsimd.org, where you can access a safe domestic violence chat to be able to seek out help and resources. And that 301-731-1203 number, that's not just for shelter placement. Of course, we can be able to assist and connect folks with shelter, but like we mentioned earlier, that's not always the appropriate resource. So we want to let people know that there are other resources too. By calling that 301 number, you can get guidance on where to go to be able to file a protective order, or what other resources that might be available, and where and how to access it. So that's all available through that. We also want to be able to I talked about a little bit about 988. That's another service that we operate at CCSI. And again, that's the mental health and suicide crisis line. But you don't have to have thoughts of suicide. You don't have to be in mental health crisis to call or text or chat that number. If you need somebody just to talk to, maybe you don't have a safe person, like we talked about earlier, to be able to talk and just be that non-judgmental sounding board. But we have trained crisis counselors available 24/7 for folks to be able to reach out to if you just want to talk or get connected to any mental health resources. So those are the main resources that we have available at CCSI.
Thank you. Denise?
Yes, so as was stated earlier, the Prince George's County Family Justice Center is the one place that someone can go to get assistance with all of their needs, ranging from law enforcement. We have the sheriff's office is there, the police department is there, the state's attorney's office is there. All of our criminal justice partners are there. We have social services, Department of Social Services, family services, even the health department is there, which provides HIV AIDS testing. Several community-based nonprofit organizations to include CCSI. We also have the House of Ruth, Amara, every and anything that someone would support to move on from a domestic violence situation, to include counseling. More recently, I'm very excited about this, we were able to contract services with sexual assault forensic exam nurses. So we're now able to provide sexual assault exams as well as strangulation screenings directly on site at the Family Justice Center, which is amazing because many times people don't want to go to the hospital. It's a very different environment. It's safe, it's confidential, it's private, and we don't require a victim to report, whereas in a hospital, you don't have the option. It has to be reported. So all in all, we are there to meet the needs of a survivor with every and any resource that they would need. Again, assistance with the protective orders, court accompaniment, crisis intervention, and then of course, connecting them to all the other wonderful agencies that are there represented in the Family Justice Center.
No, thank you for that. I think you made such a good point about the avenues that survivors might use, especially if they feel like they have to report. So basically being in a safe space where they know that they can move at their own pace.
Right.
And they won't be forced into making any type of decision that they're not ready to make.
Yep.
So I think that's important when we're looking at resources to share with our family and our loved ones, or just looking for ourselves, knowing that that's available. That's something. Please utilize these resources. So what we're going to do as an office, we still lost the sheriff. He has a PDF that we will share on our page of all the resources with the Sheriff's Department and then the resources from both organizations. What I'll say for the Sheriff's Department, I know that they also have a pilot division that's been working specifically around domestic violence. I know our hope as a council is that we can expand those services, because one thing that we do realize happens a lot when someone does reach out and calls 911 for whatever reason. It's a touch point and then they're gone. And then we're not seeing that continued checking in, follow-up with either caseworkers or information. And it's not because I believe our police department doesn't want to do it. It's because when we think about the volume of calls and the things that they have to address. And so what has been amazing, I think, with the pilot program with the Sheriff's Department is that they've started to do that continued outreach to someone once they've been once they've interacted with the Sheriff's Department and they've been called out for the areas that they do have under their purview. And so our hope is that we can continue to have that expanded across the county, because I think that can make all the difference.
Absolutely. Yeah, because what you're referring to are their SVAs, their special victim advocates that get those supplemental calls sheets after they've gone to a call, and they follow up with them. And the other great thing about it is that after following up with them, they find that the individual needs, counseling or may need to get legal support. So again, all of those services are available to them. So it's an ongoing, sustained continuum of care, which is really what people need. And you pointed out the follow-up is critical. It shouldn't be a one and done and you're off, because people need more support. So absolutely.
Exactly. And it goes back to what y'all were saying earlier. It's not just as simple as leave. There's all these barriers and you won't know what it is that person needs. Right. It could be fear for custody of their children. It could be financial needs. There could be so many different avenues. And so you won't know until you have that second layer of conversation about resources and connect them to what they need. So I want to thank both of you for taking the time to have this important conversation. This won't be the last time we have this conversation, and it's important that we do this continued work outside of Domestic Violence Awareness Month, because that was one of the things that I realized we felt like we just had 30 days to have the conversation, and then we'd come back and have the conversation again next year for 30 days. And so how do we make this just a continued conversation? Because it has to be, if we want to even get close to addressing this issue. As a council, we have a domestic violence grant. Specifically, we award $500,000 worth of funding annually to organizations that focus around domestic violence. So we will share that information out to the community as well, and organizations that are doing amazing work that need resources. And then also, as a council, I think it's important that we continue to look at other ways that we can address domestic violence. And so my office has taken a pledge to look at possible policy changes that we can support on the state level, and then policies and resources that we can invest in here on the county level to really start to tackle domestic violence in a real way. And so I look forward to rolling those out to the community and working with you all to make those things a reality. So again, I thank everyone for tuning in, and we will share all of the resources that were shared today with y'all. And did you either have last comments that you wanted to make before we close?
I would just say thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate the fact, as I said earlier, that you are keeping this on the forefront and that it's not just something that we talk about in October. And we're starting a camp this summer for children who've been exposed to domestic abuse. So I can help you with your efforts to want to do something by supporting us in that. So really appreciate it. And you're going to have our information up, 301-780-8008 and PGC, FamilyJusticeCenter.org is our website. So again, thank you.
Thank you, Erica.
Yes, also wanted to say thank you for not only providing this platform and this conversation, but for also sharing your story. We recognize that it's not easy to be able to talk about, experienced abuse. And so we just want to thank you, because I know that sharing and hearing your story is also encouraging others that are listening to this. And so thank you again. And also just want to be able to leave folks with, if you are experiencing domestic violence, it is not your fault. There are resources and services are available, and we are here for you there. This community in Prince George's County, we're working really hard to be able to provide the resources and to let people know that there is hope. And so we just wanted to leave everybody with that there is hope. If you're a man or a woman, and that's another thing to be able to share as well, because we know and recognize that men are also survivors of abuse.
No, that's so important. Men, women, and then also the conversation. We didn't dive into it much here, but the LGBTQ plus and the dynamics of violence, women on women violence, men on men, and sometimes how it's not seen the same. Especially for me, like being, as many know, I'm openly bisexual, and the abuse was when I was with my partner of 10 years, which was a woman. And so it was seen differently. And so I think it's really important that we continue to have that conversation about abuse and how it can affect everyone and the dynamics of relationships. So that might be the next conversation that we have to dive into that. So again, thank you everyone for tuning in. If you ever need anything, please reach out to the District 7 office and we'll do our best to connect you to the resources that you need. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you. Goodbye.